Welcome to Tokyo Jazz Joints podcast. I'm not sure if it's episode 1 or episode 2. The strange situation we all find ourselves in, sort of one of the happy byproducts of that was that we got together last week and recorded a bit of a chat between ourselves about the project. Got some really nice feedback, some nice comments on YouTube and other places. So we decided to turn this into a regular podcast. And we've got some episodes planned out over the next weeks and months to give you a real flavor of behind the scenes kind of feel for the project and what inspired us to do it. James, are you there in Yokohama?
I am here in Yokohama, and nice to chat with you again, Philip.
Cool. Okay. So what are we going to talk about today then?
Well, I thought that what best thing we should do is maybe give a little bit of background for our listeners outside of Japan who are interested in the photo project and interested in jazz and interested in Japan, but have never actually visited one of these jazz cafes, one of these classic jazz kissaten. So starting with the real basics of what is a jazz kissaten. And I think the most important thing to start with is that these establishments predate World War II. You know, like a lot of people, when I came to Japan, I thought that two of my favorite things are baseball and jazz. And I thought both of them were introduced after the war when the Americans occupied the country. And then I found out that that was not true, that both of those things were here way, way before World War II. The Japanese imported both jazz and baseball sometime around the 1920s. Actually, baseball was even earlier than that. And there were swing dance halls in Ginza, the ritzy part of Tokyo, in the 1920s, just like, you know, the Roaring Twenties happened in New York and all across Europe. That sort of happened here too, in what they call the Taisho period. Unfortunately, as Japan militarized and became very nationalistic, these jazz locations were considered, you know, degenerate culture, degenerate Western culture, and they were closed down. But the day the war ended, two things sprouted up in the Shinjuku area, in particular of Tokyo, and that was the black market, and that was jazz bars and jazz cafes. So the tradition goes way, way back further than most people know. And the second thing to know about these jazz kissaten is that they are very much a Japan-only phenomenon. That's for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that, you know, after the war, when things were really, you know, tight here, it was very hard to get imported records. They were very expensive. You know, people couldn't even afford record players. So if you want to hear a new album that came out sometime in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, for the most part, you had to go to one of these cafes to listen to them. So the idea of going to an establishment to listen to a record was pretty much established at that period. And it's something that didn't happen in other jazz-loving countries like France or the US. I mean, growing up in Europe, you never saw, when you went to hear jazz, it was pretty much live music, right?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that, just to add even further context to that, is just specifically why jazz. I think, you know, without going into too much Japanese history, but when Japan kind of finally opened up to the outside world and during the Meiji period, sort of in the late 1860s, I think, you know, there was the biggest drive was for modernity and to kind of make Japan what they saw as a modern country. So I think jazz, particularly into the 20th century, was really tied up with that, this idea of jazz being kind of like a modern music. And so, you know, it became really popular in the sense that it was identified with progress and modernity. And I think for me, like, what's really interesting is when you talk to people about this project and you talk about Japan, a lot of people don't make that association of Japan and jazz. And, you know, like, it's funny for us because doing this project, like, the two are inextricably intertwined, but yet, like, a lot of people, when you say Japan, they have these kind of like very sort of Hollywood kind of stereotypical images of Japan. But actually, we know, as do other people who've been to Japan, that like jazz is really tied up in Japanese culture and in some ways very mainstream. And I remember one time we were out somewhere at, having a drink maybe before we went to a place and just something like Coltrane or something came on just in some random bar or some family restaurant or something, and like it's not something that you normally expect to hear in those places.
It's funny because I'm trying to remember when that was, but it was probably so many times. You know, it's hard to pinpoint. But you're exactly right. It goes, well, actually, it goes in parallel lines. It goes with modernity, but it also goes with the, you know, the whole idea of improvisation, which is found in quite a few different Japanese traditional arts. And music as well. So if you combine all of those things together, and then you combine the specific conditions in post-war urban Japan, where living spaces were very cramped. So even if you were one of the few people who could afford a stereo, you couldn't be pumping out the new Coltrane record in 1960. Your neighbors
Yeah.
would kill you, right?
Yeah. Even
So
nowadays, right, with the thin paper walls.
oh yeah, yeah, sure, sure. So it became a kind of thing like to gather to listen to the album, not just to go listen to live music. Where in New York, you said, "Oh, I'm going to go listen to some jazz." Back in those days, that automatically meant a live gig. Whereas here, it would be either you could go catch some live music, or you could go to one of these cafes where the owner would just have hundreds and over time thousands of albums. And definitely something to emphasize for our listeners outside the country is that in those days, we're talking about the post-war period now, 40s, 50s, and 60s, I guess up until the 70s, right? You walk into one of these cafes in the daytime, and there was pretty much no talking allowed.
Mm.
Um, it was a time to listen to the music. So in the daytime, and there's still a couple of cafes like that now, you walk in, you'll see pretty much the decor is mostly all the record albums along one or two walls, maybe a couple posters, some old magazines and stuff. But you're there to listen to the music. You sit down, you order your coffee or your beer or whiskey, and the music is loud enough that you can't really talk anyway in a lot of these places.
Yeah. I mean, all the
Now,
places. So, like, for those of you listening, all the places that we do mention are all on the project website, which is www.tokyojazzjoints.com. And the one that springs to mind in Tokyo that we went to was Eagle, obviously, which I think still has at certain times of the day has a kind of a no talking policy. And if you want to see that in sort of visual images, there's also a place on the site down in Kobe called Jam Jam, and I think they have this huge cavernous place sort of underground, and they have the whole cafe is actually split into two sections. So you've got like a kind of a talking section, and then you've got the other side where all the chairs face the speakers. And that's the kind of the no talking side where you just go to listen. And actually, you'll see it in some of the other photographs where often, and certainly traditionally that was the case, where all the seating was actually lined up facing the speakers, and it almost like church or kind of like that kind of style of concert rather than like what we would associate with cafe style seating and stuff.
oh, there's at least 6 or 7 places that have that seating arrangement
Yeah.
where you sit next to the person, whoever you've gone with, but you're not going to a jazz cafe to have a long conversation to catch up with your friend anyway. These are places that you're meant to go listen to the music at loud volume on a good audio system. So the idea that asking the owner to turn down the music doesn't, I mean, that's just unthinkable.
Although I do remember that one time, I think it's one of my standout memories actually, and we'll probably talk about this place as a highlight in a different podcast. But a place called Charmont up in the sort of older area of
Yes,
Tokyo, up in the
yes.
Oshimachi area, and I have a distinct memory of James and I going in. We just about found it. We kind of went up these tiny little rickety staircase. And we went in, and the owner, I think he's only open sporadically during the week because amazingly, he also runs his own dental practice during the week. So he comes down in the evenings to open up this jazz place. And I'll never forget it because we sat down at the bar. I think we'd already been to a couple of places, and he put on Eric Dolphy live at the 5 Spot. And he knew every note of that record. I remember him stopping at certain points when there was a break in the music and then starting back up. And he was absolutely loving this record. And then as we sat at the bar, there was a couple, sort of slightly older couple came in with like a grown daughter. And I remember the three of them going down to the end of the bar, looking sort of a little confused, maybe not completely where they expected to end up. Ordered, I think, a couple of drinks, and then at one point, the father called over the owner to ask him. Basically, we realized later to turn the music down, and I distinctly remember him telling them that if they didn't like it, they could just clear off. Which, to anyone who's been to Japan, will know is definitely not the customer service that you normally expect, and it just shows like how dedicated these places are to jazz and what they do more than anything else. There's no kind of attention really in that sense paid to sort of, is the customer okay, and oh, very sorry about the noise, and what can we do. It's all just about the music, and it's about the experience of being there. And I'll never forget that night when we went in there.
I remember that so vividly. Yeah, absolutely. What a star. That's Dr. Nishioka. And I remember he also gave us some really tasty bourbon
That's
for
right.
free
Yep.
on our way
Yep.
out, which I normally don't drink. But that's what you just said there is a really important point for people who want to understand uh, the nature of what jazz kisaten, jazz cafes, and jazz bars are. The owners, these people, when they opened a lot of these places, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were outsiders to the Japan Inc. miracle. They were entering the nightlife, so to speak. So they clearly weren't doing it for the money. They were not a part of mainstream society. And that sort of feeling like lingers on today. I mean, yeah, they run a business, they got to pay the rent and they have to pay their bills and stuff. But I mean, wouldn't you say that, we've been to over 160 places, and very, very few of them have made explicit changes to make it a more customer friendly experience for a non-deep jazz fan. Most of them are pretty dirty, old, dusty, incredibly smoky for the most part, although that's changing. The menu is limited. The coffee, to be honest, is not that great for the most part, and you certainly don't want to eat in a jazz cafe. Now,
Well, no,
just
we differ there, James. To be fair, like I'm always quite happy to eat the otoshi that come out. Usually, I mean, there's been a couple of exceptions, but you're not
yeah,
quite so keen. But so I usually get double the portion of like nuts or chips or whatever it is that comes.
I'm thinking some more 2-day old cold slaw with a fish paste on it, which is
I draw the
just
line at those. I think in
yeah.
Shiramuren, which is that place in Golden Guy in Shinjuku, where I remember
Uh,
that huge wholesale bag of stuff that looked literally
I
like
mean, the expiry
bird
date on
food.
that must have been 10 years for sure.
It was just
But
dry.
that's just the funny thing, right? Because people often ask me through my website, which is the info, my information site, Tokyo Jazz site. They'll be like, oh, can we get lunch there? And I'm like, are you kidding me, man? Like you're in Tokyo, you're in a place with the best food in the world. Why would you want to eat in a jazz cafe? Like you're going there for the music and have a drink.
Yeah,
You don't go. You're not gonna go there to eat. Don't waste one of your great Tokyo meals in one of these places. Um, but I mean, I think that's like you said, giving a good picture of what these places are, so you can see from all the photos on the website, the sort of the decor is based around the music, the seating is based around the music, and the owners, they are dedicated to the music. They're
yeah,
clearly not in it to make tons of money. I,
yeah,
I, I don't think any of them ever really had. I mean, most of the ones I've talked to have never left the country,
yeah,
let alone they don't really take days off.
yeah,
Um, so the jazz spots, I mean, I think that, like, as we've gone along on the project, we've really learned more and more that each place is like, okay, a vision of the owner, or their kind of what their second home is like. But they do have a lot of consistencies about them as well, right?
yeah.
I mean, there's always attention to the audio. The records always have a really prime place in the shop. A couple places have them hidden, but for the most part, you see them when you walk in, right?
And there's the odd place I think that clearly sort of switched over to CDs in the 80s, but like generally speaking, most of the places it's still based around vinyl, isn't it? So
Mm.
let's just have a little think about the name. So the name, I came up with the name Tokyo Jazz Joints. It's funny because on my phone it still has a question mark on it, and anytime I use Siri to type a message where I put Tokyo Jazz Joints, it automatically puts a question mark after it, because I think it was sort of a working title initially, and then it just became the way that we started to talk about the project, and it eventually it became the name of the project. And we toyed maybe at one time about the idea of Japanese jazz joints, but I think the project very much started in Tokyo. We both lived there. It was very much identified with Tokyo initially, albeit it's kind of spread beyond. But we use joints, I suppose, as that collective term for all the places. But maybe it's just worth digging a little bit deeper into the difference. You mentioned kisaten, which literally translated is coffee shop, and then also there's kind of jazz bars. Now
Actually, it translates as tea house, I think, is more accurate. But yeah, same idea, right? Coffee
yeah,
shop, cafe,
yeah,
tea house. Well, no, that's exactly right. I mean, you have the difference being really just the opening hours, because a lot of these places do have the same kind of vibe to them, right? But
Yeah,
if it's open in the afternoon for coffee, and there's some old magazines, jazz magazines on a shelf, then you would call it a jazz kissa, a jazz cafe.
yeah,
If it opens past 6 or 7, and
mhm,
maybe the seating is only along a counter, you'd call it a jazz bar.
yeah,
So there are some subtle differences, but the atmosphere and the vibe is very similar. So you were right, jazz joints was really perfect, because even a couple places that we've been to, well, quite a few, they have live music in the corner sometimes, but they're not a club, right?
yeah,
So you
yeah,
wouldn't want to call it a jazz club.
yeah. So, how do we go about the sort of deciding then to the places that we kind of approached in terms of the project? Do we want to go into that a bit about like where do we start? We mentioned in the last episode obviously about Pithecanthropus, so we don't necessarily need to go over that again. But
Right.
the kind of
Right.
plan
Well,
of attack.
I remember, yeah, because you had said to me when you pitched the idea to me, that you had seen the places I profiled on my website at the start were mostly the older ones,
Yeah,
because that was where I like to hang out. So I think we kind of decided at first, and that's why we went to Pithecanthropus first, because that was one of the oldest ones, and I didn't realize that the original owner, who was quite sick, had a plan to sell it on to a younger guy, because I was worried it was going to close.
yeah,
So that was kind of the impetus. There was like, okay, why don't we start with like the ones that we know the owners are pretty old, because we don't know when they're going to close. And I think that was, we started in pretty much in central Tokyo for the first 3 or 4 months, was it, before
yeah.
we even
We
got
kind
to the
of spread
suburbs.
out gradually from those areas. I think, I mean, for me as a photographer, like I predominantly, I suppose my stuff is kind of documentary, so it's kind of preserving moments in time, if you like, or scenes or movements. Like I tend to focus on kind of music and those kind of musical subcultures, like the jazz dancers. I started a little bit of work with the rockabilly scene in Tokyo as well. And I think for me, like the impetus was very much to record these places for posterity, because, from obviously talking to you, looking at your website, and just seeing how quickly Tokyo changes, particularly with the Olympics, which was on the horizon, like 6 or 7 years down the line when we began the project. I think like it was a way of recording those places for posterity, because they were starting to disappear, and my sense was very much like if you don't, or someone doesn't record and photograph these places now, you'll never be able to do it again. And like we know from doing the project now for 5 years that actually quite a lot of the places that we've been to, and we'll probably focus on specific ones in another episode, but they've gone. And so I'm imagining, certainly from having been to other places and seen photographs that the owners have, that probably the only coherent set of photographs of some of these joints that no longer exist are the ones on Tokyo Jazz joints. And I think that's fantastic that we've managed to kind of record these places, because without this selection of photos of these different joints, there's no evidence really that they existed, some of them.
That is exactly right. That we spent a lot of time talking about that in the early parts of the project. Like, we've been in Japan for a long time, and we've seen people doing a lot of different projects, whether it's websites, photo projects, film, on so many different aspects of Japanese culture. But as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the time it comes out real stale,
Mm.
real mainstream white bread stuff. Oh, this is tea, this is kimono, this kind of idealized version of what the Japanese, many of them, like to project to the world, and what a lot of the world wants to see in Japan. And I personally have no patience for any of that stuff. I find it really boring. It has nothing to do with daily life here, as it really is. And going into these jazz spots, which, like you said, they've been documented a little bit in Japanese magazines. There's several famous jazz photographers who are Japanese, but none of this stuff was accessible to a non-Japanese reader, or somebody in the country.
Yeah,
And it was quite incredible to think that even though there's so many people who collect Japanese jazz records around the world, not a single person had ever come to really document it the way that we were doing it. I mean, it was almost as if we saw this huge, highway ramp appear before us. And it
yeah.
was like, oh yes, let's take it. That's going to be our thing. We can do this.
I think we never
Um,
imagined too, like when we started. I mean, I think it would be wrong to give people the impression that we kind of set out to to record this whole scene across the country, because I think when I look back on the photos now, I mean, I remember certain milestones thinking, oh wow, like we've done 20,
Yes.
and then it was
Right.
50, and then I remember posting something on social media about Kelly, which was like the 100th one.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
we
yeah.
managed, and it's been another sort of 60 since that. And, hopefully in this year, depending on how things pan out, we'll try and get another 30 or 40. We have a list of places that we still have to go and visit. So it kind of very organically progressed from 1 to 10 to 20 to 50. And sometimes you kind of have to pinch yourself to think, wow, like 160, and that was never the plan. But I mean, again, it's 160 places that, may not have been photographed at all in any sort of coherent way.
And
Um,
what's incredible is that we're not even close to done. I mean,
yeah,
it's insane to think that there's that many in a country this size.
yeah,
But like you said, the almost I feel like the importance of doing it comes in a bunch of different categories, because it's a part of Japanese post-war history. So I think we touched on this maybe in episode 1, but you can look at the project from multiple angles. You can look at it as, I'm interested in Japan, and this is a part of Japanese post-war history, the way they incorporated this foreign musical culture. You can look at it from just the jazz angle, like, oh my God, this is so cool. Look at these spots with all these jazz records,
yeah,
and you can also look at it from the photo side, the fact that the physicality of these shops. And we'll
yeah,
definitely get into how you approach taking the pictures, because that's a
mm,
very long conversation on another episode. But you can look at it as a photo project, not being interested in jazz at all. So there's a lot of different reasons why I think this is important work, and especially emphasize one more time that if this is a part of Japanese history, and a very important part of Japanese cultural history that so many people are just not familiar with, even here. Even we've had, how many times have we had Japanese friends or acquaintances ask us, like, wait, what is a jazz cafe?
yeah,
What is a jazz kissa
yeah.
tent? And we're like, what, are you kidding?
Or I think the ones that do know of them, I think they have a certain. It's probably hard to get across, but I think they have a certain sort of like a seedy, slightly kind of sketchy sense that when people talk about them, they're not even if they do know of these places, they're kind of they talk about them as if it's somewhere that they'd never be found, or somewhere that they'd be, they would rather avoid. And even in some cases, I remember in Impro, the guy specifically asking not to photograph him or the customers, because
Yes,
again,
I remember that. Yes.
yeah, to
Well,
be
that's
seen in those places, right, would not
yeah.
necessarily go across well with like your boss at work or whatever it is,
Oh,
So,
sure, sure. Well, and that as well is going to be a fun episode when we talk about the people who go to these.
yeah,
I think that's an entire episode to just talk about the people, the customers, and the owners.
yeah,
But again, like I said, these establishments very much they sprouted up after the war in black market neighborhoods. They were definitely outside of mainstream, so they always kept that kind of how would you say, they had a little bit of a stink to them in
yeah,
mainstream Japanese
yeah,
society. So sometimes when you tell people, they ask, oh, where did you hang out last night? I say, oh, I went to such and such neighborhood to a jazz bar. They'll just kind of look like, oh, but you're a foreigner, you shouldn't go to that neighborhood,
yeah.
and you're
I
like,
think
wait,
that's what's
what?
fascinating too, is that because they are very much like a combination of Japan and sort of, for want of a better term, not Japan. So there is an element of formality and rules and regulations about them when you go in, but then also what we found is, like, when you show that you're into the music, you show what you're doing, the owners are open up much quicker than you would expect normally in Japanese society. They talk, they'll tell you all these stories, they're joking around with you. Again, Japan's famously very organized place, is famously very clean and sort of sanitary place, and yet when you go into these jazz joints, some of them look like they've never been tidied up after an earthquake.
Oh yeah,
They're
yeah,
dirty. The food
yeah,
is not particularly good quality. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
you were mentioning about the drinks earlier. Even, I mean, I remember going into Garo, that which, if you look on the website, is essentially looks like a shack. I mean, it's literally a
Yeah.
corrugated iron shack in this beautiful gentrified neighborhood. And I remember trying to order a
Garo's
drink, and the only two
unbelievable.
things were gin and whiskey. And so I said, "Oh, could I have a gin and tonic?" And she went, "With no tonic." So it's basically a choice of straight gin or straight whiskey. So I went with a whiskey, but so it's not. there's so much about them that are Japanese, and obviously
Yeah,
they've come from there,
completely,
but they're very
completely. Yeah,
anti-Japanese in many ways as well,
completely.
right?
It's such a hidden, beautiful part of the culture that unfortunately so many visitors to the country never get a chance to experience. And
Yeah,
I think that ties into, like you said, about the locations too. Like in some of the older places, they're often not in areas profiled in guidebooks.
mm,
Like you mentioned Impro, which is in an area called Oimachi. It's only one station away from Shinagawa, a major Shinkansen bullet train station, where thousands of foreign tourists and business people go every day. But they would never go one station past that to this very, very old drinking area called Oimachi, to a place called Impro. I mean, I've had people mail into us. They've talked to us on Twitter or Instagram, and they've just said, like, you guys are crazy. How did you find all these
mm,
places? And I mean, part of it is because, look, we've done the research, but also we live here. And when you live somewhere, you just have better access to all of this. And that's another part of the thing is, like, as much as I love the interiors and the owners, and I do love it very much. The other main goal for me of the project is just to show a different part of Japan to people.
yeah,
That
yeah.
you and I have this ability. We speak the language. We lived here. We have connections. We can show something that no other foreigners have done. Like,
So
this sounds like
what about
showing
the
off, though.
language then? Like, so like, when we're all able to travel internationally again, and people go to Japan, what, first of all, if you don't speak Japanese, is that gonna prevent you from enjoying these places? And secondly, if you do find them or you do venture into them, and sometimes they're not, certainly aesthetically at the start, they're not the most welcoming looking places. Like, what's the kind of etiquette? Like, what would you recommend, that how do people approach it? So that they don't get kicked out before they've even had a chance to sit down.
Sure. Well, I think that, I mean, number one, if you're if you're listening to this podcast, you're already probably inclined to be adventurous and to go and find one of these
Yeah,
places. But I would say the most important thing is this is just obviously express that you love the music, because these are places devoted to music, they're devoted to jazz. So if you do that, you're going to get a warmer welcome. Um, Definitely do not speak loud. Being American, I'm very well familiar with American tourists. I myself am a very loud and fast speaker, but tone it down a little bit. Don't go in and being the ugly tourist. Okay, these places are kind of like, despite being dingy and run down or dusty or however we describe them, they are very, very serious about the music. Okay, so don't go in there looking to have a drink up with your friends on vacation to take
mm,
pictures. Be respectful, be quiet, and try to, just say a couple words in Japanese to the owner and to the customers in there. And I think you'll find that you'll get a very, very warm welcome. I mean, even before I learned the language and I went to some of these places and I couldn't say anything, I could just order a beer. And you do feel uncomfortable because you're the foreigner and you don't know how the system works. But I saw he was playing a Charles Mingus record, and I was, oh yeah, Mingus, oh, I have that. And he just looked at me, and I was like, I looked in my dictionary and I told him in Japanese, I have this record and I like it. And he had a big smile on his face.
yeah, and I
And
mean,
the next,
some of the owners, I mean, they do have a handful of words in English. Some of them speak English reasonably well because they've either got this obsession with America, or they've like worked with musicians that come to places and stuff like that. So it's not a case of if you don't speak Japanese you can't communicate, and without being too schmaltzy and sort of Disney, like that music is something that kind of unites you both, and so like there is definitely that connection there. Even if you can't say what you want to say through language, that connection across like whatever tunes he's playing, or even like a thumbs up and stuff, I think kind of really can build some bridges with the owners as well. And they really appreciate people, I think, coming in for the music, and people who get it, and who are not just in for like a night out, or a bit of a laugh or whatever.
the other thing is bring cash. None of these
Oh
places will
yeah,
take
good
credit
point.
cards.
Yeah,
Always bring cash. Be prepared for a table charge, but it's less than you pay for a tip back home, so don't
yeah,
complain about it. And yeah, I mean, I would say that if you be prepared to have very, very, very narrow seating. Some of these places can be pretty tight, and for Americans in particular who are used to having a little more personal space, it can be a little bit
yeah.
uncomfortable. They just the other day, from April 1st, changed the smoking rules in the Tokyo metro area. So I don't know how that affects the jazz cafes though, because they're very small. But be prepared. If you are sensitive to smoke, you may not want to stay long. But generally, I don't think that, most of the places we've been to, we've never really felt uncomfortable.
No,
And,
and
you,
it all adds to the beautiful intensity of the experience, doesn't it?
yeah, yeah. Oh, and you know what? Also, turn your phone off, man. Like,
Yeah, good point.
if you're
Yeah,
going to a jazz bar, you're going to listen. Don't be sending texts and stuff. It's rude and it looks annoying. It's like you're going in there to have a drink and listen to the music.
yeah.
So, if you want to do your mail and stuff, go to a chain coffee shop, but don't go to one of these places.
And if you do want to find out places to go, there's only one place to go. That's Tokyo Jazz site, and then obviously TokyoJazzJoints.com if you want to have a look at the pictures of the places before you go, so you can choose your seating in advance. It's probably a good place to wrap things up there for this episode, though. Thanks to all the people that gave us really nice feedback and comments. The
Oh,
podcast
and
is
especially shout out, and I forget who this was. Who maybe we should put this in our program intro online. It said, "What happens when the Northern Irishman and a New Yorker walk into a jazz bar or
there we
something
go.
like that?" Did you
Well,
see that?
we haven't found out the punchline yet, but
Yeah. Well, and before we go, we've got a lot of different conversations coming up. So just to give a little bit of a teaser, like Philip, like you said, we're going to talk about the customers. We're going to talk about the owners. We're going to talk about some specific joints that really stand out in Yokohama and Tokyo. And one that I'm really looking forward to is the one that you labeled the Three Beatles.
oh
And
yeah,
maybe we'll just leave that as a teaser. But the Three Beatles are three very important people in the history of jazz shops in Japan.
yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to that one.
So yeah, if you want to hear the podcast, you can find it. If you haven't already, obviously you can find it on Apple Podcast. It's on Spotify as well, and SoundCloud. So please go there and, like they always say, if you like it, please rate it, review it, and obviously the more ratings and reviews that we get, the more listenership we can get for the project, and then hopefully we can get beyond the 200 mark and beyond before we publish this long-awaited book. Thanks for this week, James. I'm going to talk to you next week. And
As always,
yeah,
thank you. And yeah, look forward to it next week, Philip. And stay safe over in beautiful Dublin town.
you too, man. Take it easy.
Okay, bye bye.
All right. See ya.